We have plenty of hard copy Bibles if anybody wants one. There are various translations. Avoid the Luther one. Avoid the Luther one if you don't read German.
Not lately.
I do not have a Book of Mormon. I do not have the New World Translation. You guys know what the New World Translation is? New World Translation is the JW one. In the beginning, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was a God.
Are you kidding?
Not kidding. Because, Jesus... Yeah. Yeah, a friend of mine, dear friend of mine, he's gone now.
That's nice.
He died at the ripe old age of 53. Yeah, he went over to Saudi Arabia, got saved, and came back to Germany. And he joined this little fundamentalist Baptist church in Bitburg, and he was always trying to get us to go. And we went a couple times, and then we moved off to England. Well, he came to England to witness the gospel to me, and brought that Bible with him. I don't normally read the King James, but I went to his funeral and I showed everybody that Bible, and I said, well, Rob must have had a prophetic word from the Lord, because, see, it's large print edition. Yeah. And we were in our 20s when he brought me that. Well, I was in my 30s, but he was in his 20s. Anyway, dear friend, this poor guy struggled his whole... He went to Trinity Seminary in Jacksonville, became an ordained Baptist minister, struggled for 20 years to find himself a poor pulpit, finally found one up in Pennsylvania, and a young couple came in for counseling, relationship counseling, not married, living together. And so he said, well, first step, one of you's got to move out. Yeah. Right? Till you're married. Well, as it turns out, she was the daughter of one of the elders, and they voted him out of the pulpit for giving good, solid biblical counseling. Yeah. But it's the world we live in. So last time we looked at the end of chapter 3 and the beginning of chapter 4. And, sorry?
What book, please?
1 Timothy. And remember, Paul gave this short gospel reiteration to Timothy there at the end of chapter 3. And he talked about the mystery of godliness. Remember that? And then we looked briefly at this word pisteuo, that he said that Jesus had been believed on, and so it really means believed into, right? And we looked at the difference between that and the Greek word for on, which is en. It's more than just believing in Jesus. We have to believe into his gospel, into his spirit. Then we looked at the beginning of chapter 4. Was it? No. Yeah, the beginning of chapter 5. We looked at Paul's warning to Timothy that some would fall away, and that they would depart from leading or following sound doctrine, and they would start to... Hey, you're back, and you're beautiful, because everybody knows back is beautiful. That's right. Well, I still say it because I haven't grown up. Anyway, so he said that people would fall away and that they would start to follow the teachings of demons. And that, unfortunately and tragically, they would get so accustomed to the lie and their consciences would be seared. Remember, the King James said that it would be seared as if by a hot iron, right? And that having their consciences seared, they would then be unable to discern the difference between the truth and a lie. And then he gave some examples of some of these false doctrines, these teachings of demons. He talked about the Judaizers that were saying that, certain meats were not, A-okay, and certain things, praise God, we can eat lobster, we can eat pork, we can eat all those things that the poor Jews back then couldn't eat. Still can't, by the way. In Israel today, you can't get a cheeseburger. Why? Because when you eat, because cheese comes from milk, right? And when you eat food, it goes into your belly and there's acids in there, and it's kind of like boiling your food, right?
Yeah, we just ate.
And a hamburger, even though it comes from a cow, is kind of like a goat, sort of. And if you mixed the cheese that came from the milk, that really came from a cow but might have come from a goat, it would be like boiling a young kid in its mother's milk. So, nope, no cheeseburgers for you. Anyway. Yep, just talk about straining a gnat and swallowing. There are all kinds of rules that you just wouldn't believe. They had rules about Concorde, right? You couldn't get on Concorde on a Sunday and fly to New York because Concorde flew fast enough for you to fly back into Shabbat. And the pilots would have to be working to fly the airplane. That's working on Shabbat. No can do. They had all kinds of rules. They had rules about spacecraft orbiting and Shabbat, what you can do on Shabbat if you're on the space station. They got rules. If there isn't a rule, they'll find a place to put a rule. Anyway, so he talked about the teachings of the Judaizers with these meats that couldn't be eaten, and then he talked about this idea of, I think he was talking about Gnosticism, where people were emphasizing mystical experiences over the solid Word of God. And then finally he advised or encouraged Timothy to train himself in godliness, and we used the parable of the talents as a framework for talking about that. Remember, we need to take this gift that we've been given and do something with it, right? So anyway, continuing on now in verse 12 of chapter 4, he says, "Let no one despise you for your youth, but set the believers an example in speech, in conduct, in love, in faith, in purity. Until I come, devote yourself to the public reading of Scripture, to exhortation," which basically just means encouragement, "to teaching. Do not neglect the gift you have, which was given you by prophecy when the council of elders laid their hands on you. Practice these things, immerse yourself in them, so that all may see your progress. Keep a close watch on yourself and on the teaching. Persist in this, for by doing so you will save," and that word save is so. We'll talk about that in a minute. "You'll save both yourself and your hearers." Now remember, Timothy had joined Paul near the beginning of his second missionary journey. Paul and Silas passed through, it was Silas, right? Paul and Silas passed through Lystra in eastern Turkey, which was Timothy's hometown. And Timothy joined them there. And they continued on through Asia Minor, and you can read all about that in Acts 15 and 16. And then later on, remember, Paul saw this vision of the man from Macedonia that said, "Come over here and help us." And so they went across from Turkey, well, what's Turkey today, into Greece, and established the church at Philippi and the churches at Corinth and Thessalonica, and the churches in Greece. You can read about that in Acts 17 and 18, the beginning of verse 18. And then they came back across to Asia Minor, and they worked for 2 years together at Ephesus, establishing the church there, until they had a riot in Ephesus. The artisans that worked on trappings for the temple of Artemis raised this argument that Paul and Timothy were destroying their business, basically, and they were trying to take away from the worship of Artemis, which really was true, if you think about it, Artemis being an idol. But anyway, so they got driven out of Ephesus, and then they went back to Greece. And you can read about that in Acts 18 and 19. So the Ephesian believers were familiar with Timothy, but they knew him really as Paul's protege, as his envoy, as a young man. Well, this had been, that was back in the early 50s. And by the time Paul's writing this letter and Timothy has returned to Ephesus as a leader in his own right, it's 10 years later. But the Ephesian elders, particularly probably the old men, were still looking on Timothy as a young, unwashed, behind-the-ears kid, right? And that's why Paul says, "Let no one despise you for your youth." And Paul knew that he'd face disrespect and he would face resistance if he had anything new to try. They were going to fight him on it, right? Paul knew that. And so he wrote these words of encouragement, both for Timothy himself, for his own self-image, his own self-confidence, and also he was writing specific directions about how Timothy should run the church until he was able to rejoin with Timothy, which he expected to do. Now remember, this letter was being written either toward the end or right after Paul's first house arrest in Rome. Remember, it said that he had a rented house and he was able to preach freely and come and go, but he had one Roman guard, right? So this letter was written right at the end of that, or just after it, or just before the end of it. Paul intended to go to Ephesus and rejoin Timothy. Acts is silent about whether he ever did that or not. And it's possible that Paul and Timothy never saw each other again. And this letter was written about 62 AD. Paul died somewhere around 67 AD. Now, the prophetic event that he's talking about in verse 14, where he says, "Do not neglect the gift you have, which was given you by prophecy when the council of elders laid their hands on you." Without doubt, the council of elders he's talking about were the elders in Jerusalem, the 12 or the 11 remaining that we know about. I think actually James had been killed by this time. But was that James the son of, or brother of Jesus, or James the son of Zebedee? I don't know. Anyway, there had already been a couple of martyrs by the time this letter was written. So presumably this prophetic event that he's talking about happened either between the second and the third missionary journeys, when Paul brought back the offering from the churches for the church in Jerusalem, or possibly, and you can read about that, by the way, in Acts 18, verses 18 through 22, happened right around 53 AD or so. Or it could have possibly been when Paul returned from his third missionary journey, just before he was arrested and killed. So, how's the drive to Sholo? Is there water in the San Pedro River Valley?
Well, there's a lot of green, and I haven't seen any water.
Yeah, it runs underground there, doesn't it?
Yeah, I'm guessing.
Pretty sure.
The farmers seem to be able to pump enough of it underground to keep their fields pretty.
Yep. So anyway, this laying on of hands may have happened after Paul returned to Jerusalem for the last time, just before he was arrested. But the spiritual gift that he's talking about, there's no doubt about that. It was, without doubt, the gift of leading a church, ministering to a fellowship, ministering to a flock of believers. So before we move on, let's look at what he says here at the end of this passage. He says that by doing all these things, Timothy will save both himself and his hearers. And the word there is sozo. Sozo. And it's translated as save, and it should be translated as save, but it's not necessarily salvation, eternal salvation, like we normally think of. Sozo can also refer to saving out of earthly threats, earthly dangers. And, you know, there is absolutely no chance that Paul would have been preaching a works-based salvation, that Timothy could save people by doing this, and the other. There's no way Paul would ever preach that. And after all, Paul had written to the Ephesians themselves, right? You guys know the verse, right, that I'm going to? Ephesians 2, for by grace you've been saved through faith, and this not your own doing, it is the gift of God, not the result of works, so that no one may boast. And just as an aside here, there was a monk about something on the order of 1,500 years later who read this, Catholic monk, who read this verse, and it convinced him that the teachings that he had been following of ritual salvation and absolution by the Catholic Church were wrong, that we're saved by grace. The guy's name was Martin Luther. So exactly what dangers Paul might have been talking about, we really don't know. Maybe he was remembering that riot at Ephesus that came very near to getting them their, lunch handed to them. And they had to kind of beat feet out of there. So Paul was kind of warning about that, I think. And church tradition, in fact, holds that Timothy himself was beaten to death in Ephesus while he was trying to stop a pagan procession in the 90s. If you need to stand up, stand. So continuing on now in chapter 5, in verse 1, he says, do not rebuke an older man, and that word there is presbyteros. We'll look at that again in a minute. But encourage him as you would a father. Younger men as brothers, older women as mothers, younger women as sisters, in all purity. Now, I'm glad I'm not like this, but older men can be quite a handful for a young pastor. We have a well-deserved reputation for stubbornness and grumpiness. So we can imagine that
We can even fall off the roof when we ain't supposed to be up there.
that's right. We can do all kinds of stuff. I'm glad I never do stuff I shouldn't do like that. And I'm glad I'm not set in my ways, and I'm glad that I'm not really adamant about my own particular opinions. I'm glad I'm always right too.
Doctor told me when I broke my back, he said, don't climb no ladders.
And you stopped climbing ladders, right? You know, I'm sure that I'm sure Timothy heard many, many times, you know, we've always done things this way, and I don't see any reason we should change now. All right. So when he came with new ideas, he got a lot of pushback. There's no doubt about it. You know, that sort of thing obviously continues today. And it's tragic because many churches are aging themselves out of existence as a result. And because we won't change, or we're resistant to changing how we approach things. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not talking about changing the gospel. I'm not talking about changing the truth that we preach. That can never change. What I'm talking about is the approach that we take to it, right?
What color the carpet needs to be.
Yeah. You know, guess what? There are churches where people adamantly refuse to read anything besides the King James. There are churches where people adamantly refuse to have any musical instruments involved in the worship. You know, and, you know, we've always done it that way. And the problem with that is that it causes young people to see the church as irrelevant to their lives. And so a lot of churches are aging themselves out. And what's even more tragic is those churches that are attractive to the young people are not preaching the gospel truth in large part. And so these young people are being led down the primrose path by false teachers. But they're relevant and exciting false teachers, right? They got the fog machines, they got the strobe lights, they got the cool music, right? But they're teaching the doctrines of demons that Paul warned about. And this problem, by the way, is compounded because guess what? The older men have the bank accounts, right? So they can choose to withhold. Well, if you're going to do that, then I ain't going to, you know. Have you ever heard that before? Does this happen? Oh, yeah. So it gives a young pastor an uphill battle trying to draw the church out of complacency and into action, gospel action, because of the intransigence of older men. And, you know, I say that being an older man. Nevertheless, older men have much to offer. We have experience, we have knowledge, we have financial assets. And so Paul encourages Timothy to patiently encourage older men to get mucked in to the work of the church. And the same concept applies today, of course. And not only that, Paul encourages Timothy to encourage the entire flock to be to treat them as brothers and sisters and fathers and mothers, as he would his own family. To be effective, a church needs to be unified, and it needs to be active. Paul wrote about this to the church in Philippi in Philippians 1, verse 27. He said, "Let your manner of life be worthy of the gospel of Christ, so that whether I come and see you or am absent, I may hear of you that you are standing firm in one spirit, with one mind, striving side by side for the faith of the gospel." So before we move on, this Greek word presbyteros that's been translated as an older man here in the English Standard Version. Some versions, like the King James, render that as elder. And that's not a bad translation, but it's this word presbyteros is distinct from the word episcope that we looked at when we were looking at overseers in chapter 3. And because many churches refer to their overseers as elders, right? You know, I know this because I are one. That's caused confusion, right? Here in 1 Timothy 5:1, presbyteros means an older man, just like it's been translated here in the ESV. And it's referring to older men in general. But later on in the chapter, in verses 17 and 19, you'll find the word again. And in those cases, it's clearly talking about older men who are leaders in the church. So that leads to even more confusion. Anyway, so in this verse, he's talking just about older men in general, not about elders per se. So before we move on, as I was reading through the rest of this chapter, I had to wonder, is Paul bipolar? All right. He was certainly passive aggressive, sometimes. Here in these first two verses of chapter 5, he's these tender verses about treating everybody as family, right? And then he launches into this some of the harshest words he ever wrote. The only harsher thing that he ever wrote that I can think of is in Galatians 5:12, when he said, that he wishes that those that were encouraging people to get circumcised to be saved would go ahead and emasculate themselves, not just circumcise themselves, by the way. Talking about going the whole way, the whole Leah Thompson way. No, he didn't do that, did he? No, sorry. Sorry. I'll start again. Anyway, there's some pretty harsh words coming up here. Still, we know that God's Spirit led Paul to write these things, so there must be a lesson that we can glean from this, and it's got to be a good lesson. It's got to be a righteous lesson. So, we'll consider it a little bit at a time, knowing that God put it there for some reason. Now, before we move on, throughout these next verses from 3 to 16, he talks exclusively about women who are widows. But the same principles could apply to men who are widowers. Nevertheless, he kept focused on female widows. We will stay focused on female widows just to avoid confusion, even though we know some of these principles could equally apply. So in verse 3, he says, "Honor widows who are truly widows, but if a widow has children or grandchildren, let them first learn to show godliness to their own household and to make some return to their parents." And he says to Timothy to make some of these widows return to their parents. By the way, in the ancient Near East, and still today in many places, they have this tradition of a dowry, right? The prospective bridegroom would pay the parents a bride price, right? And the parents were supposed to keep that bride price for the daughter if she ever had to come back, so that she would have some resources,
So
right?
instead of me giving Janie all my money, I should have given it to her daddy.
That's exactly right. But he should have kept it. He should have kept it for Janie, just in case Janie got fed up with you, which he probably knew was very likely.
But now he's passed on to glory. So what happens to the money?
Well, I assume that she got some sort of inheritance.
A little bit.
Yeah. Anyway, so they had this tradition, and that's what Paul's talking about. That if the widow has parents, then she should return to her parents. Let's see. He says, "Make some return to their parents, for this is pleasing in the sight of God. She who is truly a widow, left all alone, has set her hope on God and continues in supplications and prayers night and day. But she who is self-indulgent, and that word there is spatalao, and we'll look at that in a minute, is dead, even while she lives. Command these things as well, so that they may be without reproach. But if anyone does not provide for his relatives, and especially for the members of his household, he has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever." Like I said, the kinder, gentler Paul apparently took a break. So this is fair enough. We should take care of our families, right? And in most human cultures, this is the way it has traditionally been. Families stayed together, right? Parents and children didn't live very far apart from each other, and often they lived in the same house, right? When we were in Germany, we lived on the top floor. The girls, 3 daughters, lived on the middle floor, and mom and dad and grandma lived on the bottom floor. It was grandma's house. And she had, by the way, had troops living in her house, military troops living in her house since 1937. And this was 1982. But initially they didn't pay. We paid. Anyway, families stayed together. They stayed in the same town, and oftentimes they stayed in the same house, right? So children were able to take care of the needs of their parents, and because they lived pretty close by. But in our modern mobile society, we might live hundreds or even thousands of miles away from our parents. So it makes it pretty hard for us to properly take care of our aging parents. And because of that, a whole industry is built up around taking care of the aged, right? We pay total strangers to provide the care for our parents that used to be provided by the children directly. And the children used to be able to do it better. Not always, but for the most part. Now, some widows don't have parents, they don't have children, they don't have brothers and sisters. They're truly by themselves, and those are the ones that Paul urges the church to take under its wing and care for. But he does warn that some of them will take advantage of that, believing that maybe they're entitled somehow to this support. And some widows take care of the church, and guess what? Some widows take advantage of their own family. Paul says here that these that are doing that are among the walking dead. Remember, he said, what did he say? You get the right words here, if I can get the page back. He said, but she who is self-indulgent is dead even while she lives. So, I kind of wish Paul wouldn't mince words and tell us how he really feels about this, Pretty harsh.
He's comparing her to the one who sets her hope on God and continues in supplications and prayers day and night.
Well,
That's
he's contrasting her.
Yeah.
Anyway, Paul uses this word spatalao to refer to these widows that are getting over on their families or on the church. The ESV translates that as self-indulgent, but it means to live luxuriously, lead a voluptuous life, or to give oneself to pleasure. If a widow possesses the means to take care of herself, she should do so. And that's much more common today than it was back then, of course. In the society back then, women really didn't have any financial life at all in the society. They were totally dependent on their men as their financial, economic anchor, if you will. So, by the way, in this whole discussion, we've been focusing on the widow's physical needs, right? But everyone in every fellowship needs to take care of the spiritual and emotional and companionship, fellowship needs of everyone else in the fellowship, not just the widows. And obviously the most critical need that a widow has is fellowship with God. And we need to support that in any way that we can as a church. It's the right thing to do. It's the human thing to do, I've said here. So continuing on in verse 9, let a widow be enrolled if she's not less than 60 years of age, having been the wife of one husband, having a reputation for good works if she's brought up children, has shown hospitality, has washed the feet of the saints, has cared for the afflicted, and has devoted herself to every good work. My dad years ago used to like to say, they've taken the personal out of personnel. Right? They made all these rules, and guess what? Folks don't fit into these nice boxes. They just don't. Paul is talking here about a widow that does fit neatly into this nice box that he's built. But sorry, Paul, sorry, Holy Spirit, life's not that neat. It's messy. And folks don't fit into these categories like this. So consider a widow, a hypothetical widow. Her husband divorced her early on when she was young, right? Put her away with a certificate of divorcement, right? The Jews were allowed to do that. Then she got remarried, but she was childless. She didn't have any brothers and sisters. Her parents had long since died, and then her husband died, her second husband died when she was 59. All right? Maybe she hadn't been active in the church because she only came to know the Lord like just before her husband died. And, like I said, she had nobody to rely on. Such a widow meets none of the criteria that Paul lists here. Not a one of them, right? To be enrolled as a ward of the church. Should the church turn her away? Well, I don't think so. What if she met all the other criteria, but she became a widow right after her 59th birthday? Should we let her starve until she turns 60? I don't know. I don't think so. Somehow there's got to be something that we can come up with for how to interpret this, how to apply it. And I think in order to do that, it would help us to look at the nature of our God and the things that he says we're to do in general. In Psalm 86, verse 15, it says, "But you, O Lord, are a God, merciful and gracious, slow to anger, and abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness." And then in Micah, he gave Micah some very succinct instructions. He's told you, and this is Micah 6, verse 8. He's told you, O man, what is good, and what does the Lord require of you? But to do justice, to love kindness, and to walk humbly with your God. And then, of course, Jesus said, "Behold, I am sending you out as sheep in the midst of wolves, so be wise as serpents, but gentle as doves." Why did I put that one in there? Because folks are going to come and try to get over on you. Yeah. Happens all the time. You don't believe me? Ask Pastor Brian. Ask what shows up on his phone recorder messages, right? You have to be wise as serpents. You need to be discerning. But err on the side of grace. That's what I would say.
I was serving in a church in New Hampshire. A guy came and approached us. He needed some money. He needed some help. A young man. Pastor down at so-and-so was helping me with it. Seemed to be able to do it anymore. Well, see, they're knocking the next door now. Get it from somebody else. But they didn't say that. Nobody said that. But we spoke with him, told him we needed to discuss his situation, we had to get back to him. I made a personal call the next day, told him, I run this body shop over here, and we got some things in the backyard here that could use some help, and if you wanna do some work, you'd be welcome to come over, click. That ended that whole scenario right there, because you have the harmless as doves, but wise as serpents. You had to use your head. Nobody said no. We offered him a solution, and he just said, "Thank you, bye." And that was the true picture of it,
So, yeah, we've got these things that Paul says here, and there are all kinds of other detailed instructions. But I think we really need to err on the side of grace. If, when in doubt, help. And if we do that prayerfully and we keep these general principles in mind about what God has directed us to, to do justice, to love mercy, to walk humbly, I don't think we'll go too far wrong, and we'll do what's pleasing to God, and we'll be good stewards of the things that He has given us.
In verse 9 where it says, let a widow be enrolled, what does that mean? Enrolled.
They're talking about basically having a list of people that they support. That's what...
The church has a list, yeah. So basically, this is instructional for the church that a person doesn't get put under the role of the church's support and with these kind of qualifications. It's not for how people should act to each other, which is the point you were making.
Well, yeah, but he was giving instructions to Timothy as the leader of the church. Yes, obviously, all of us have the moral obligation to support our brothers and sisters when we see a need.
Right, but he's saying don't let the church get put in the spot to have to do this unless some things are fitting and right the way they should be.
But like I said, I can easily see examples where the church should get involved in helping someone that doesn't fall into this box.
I agree.
And you know what? We will be doing what's pleasing in the sight of God. We'll be good stewards of the things He's given us. And you know what? Sometimes we're going to get ripped off. When we get ripped off, not if, when we get ripped off, what do? Pick up the pieces, we press forward. We write it up as a lesson learned, right? But we still, next time, err on the side of grace. All things being equal, we don't want to let getting ripped off harden our hearts. At least when we do that, we won't be turning away someone who has a genuine need and has no other options. And hopefully, one day, because of that, we'll get to hear, well done, good and faithful servant. You were faithful over a little. I will make you and set you over much. Enter into the joy of your master. So, moving on, in verse 11, he says, but refuse to enroll younger widows, for when their passions draw them away from Christ, they desire to marry, and so incur condemnation for having abandoned their former faith. Besides that, they learn to be idlers, going about from house to house, and not only idlers, but also gossips and busybodies, saying what they should not. So I would have younger widows marry, bear children, manage their households, and give the adversary no occasion for slander. For some have already strayed after Satan. Well, wow, who knew that all young widows were like this? I didn't know, did you? It's another example of taking the personal out of personnel, right? Obviously, not all young widows are like this, right? Some young widows will stray into these things, and that's what Paul is saying. Beware of this. And undeniably, church leaders have a duty, a sacred charge to be good shepherds of their flock and be good stewards of the blessings that God has given the church, and do that diligently. We need to prayerfully seek discernment. Which applicants are righteous applicants, if you will, and which are not, which are just trying to get over. And sometimes it's hard to tell. It really is. If someone has legitimate needs that can't be filled any other way, then we need to get behind them. If there are other options, we need to show that person those options. Like what you were saying. Hey, I got some work over here. You could make some money. Anyway. And I thought of something. One other thing that I thought of here was, remember, Paul said that he doesn't allow women to teach. He doesn't allow them to be leaders, right? Well, young childless widows that don't have a parental home to go back to, and they're not allowed to get a job in Paul's church. Is it any wonder that some of them had fallen away and become idlers and gossips and busybodies? The old saying goes that idle hands are the devil's playground, right? I got an idea. Maybe Timothy could have offered these ladies jobs as deacons, or teachers of the young children, where they could earn a modest living instead of just refusing to enroll them and sending them on their way. Here again, church leaders need to be cautious. They need to do this prayerfully, not hurriedly. They need to take their time, do their research. We've recently had just such an example in our church, someone that, obviously destitute, but once you peel the onion back a little bit, it wasn't so sweet on the inside. Let's just put it that way. We can't make these decisions in haste. We have to do our homework, and we have to seek godly counsel. A pastor has to seek godly counsel from his appointed overseers. We need to do this as a team. We were in a church previously, I won't say where, but essentially the pastor was the guy, right? Whatever the pastor said goes. And the problem with that is pastors is human beings, and because they're human beings, they make mistakes. So a pastor needs to fall on his brothers that have been appointed to the position of advising him, and then he needs to humbly take that advice if it's sound, and seek God in discerning whether that advice is sound. Many a pastor has burned out from trying to guide the ship by himself, right? And not spreading the load. I'm not a fan of Andy Stanley by any stretch of the imagination. I think some of his teaching is way off the charts. But he did say something that I thought was dead on. Speaking to pastors, he said, "Only do what only you can do." Right? Let your flock help you. It'll be a blessing for them, not just... Anyway, so continuing in verse 16, he says, "If any believing woman has relatives who are widows, let her care for them, and let the church not be burdened so that it may care for those who are truly widows." This seems like a no-brainer to me.
The key right there, that's the
Yeah.
point he's making. Don't let the church be burdened.
Yeah.
Unless it should be. If it should be, then take the burden. But if it shouldn't be, don't.
And not just the church. As we said just a few minutes ago, the whole body has the obligation to care for brothers and sisters that are in need, right? I hate to sound, pro Karl Marx in any way, right? But what's the watchword or the slogan of communism, right? From each according to his ability to each according to his need. Well, in the perfect world, that would work great. We don't live in a perfect world, unfortunately. But, we need to all beware of and shoulder the burden to care for our brothers and sisters, if we can, however we can. And by the way, in this, what Paul talks about here, he talks about family members. He doesn't say anything about how close they are in blood, right? It's not like, well, you can do this, but not for your second cousin, right? Or you should do this, but not to, you can do it for your brother and sister, But we have a duty to our entire family in Christ. And not not only our families, but the whole world. Right? Now, Jesus was talking to his disciples specifically, the 12, well, 11 by that time. But he said, because I think Judas had already gone out to do his dirty business. But he said, by this they will know that you are my disciples, in that you love one another. So that was all I had for this evening. God willing, we'll continue next time and make our way through Timothy. This whole thing about widows to me wasn't as difficult as I expected it to be. And I don't, I'd love to hear your ideas on it, but I think really it's a no-brainer. We need to err on the side of grace, but be wise as serpents and honest or harmless as doves.
I don't remember exactly what the figures were, but in thinking about single parent households this day and time, is probably into the majority of the population now. But when I was growing up, it just wasn't like that. Now, nothing against black folk, but all of the kids that I grew up with that was of color, there was no daddy in the home. Matter of fact, the daddy was daddy of multiple homes. And well, daddy won't be down till sometimes in September, that was but America now has adopted that.
And in a good many cases, the daddies are wards of the state temporarily. My information is old, but as of about 10 years ago, I read somewhere that the average American child, so that is more than 50% of the children in America today, have never seen a nuclear family, mom, dad, and kids, and pet dog,
And the church,
modeled. They haven't. Not only have they not been in one, they've never seen one. Not with mom and dad, not with uncle and aunt, not with grandpa and grandma. They've never seen one modeled. More than 50% of the children in America.
and all this was based on the family unit back then, and today we have gotten so far away from the family unit that the other generations that are coming along really won't even understand the family unit.
That's not an accident.
No.
We have an enemy who seeks to kill, steal, and devour, and that's his wedge. Destroying a family is the way he destroys the society.
Yeah.
But can you imagine how that must break God's heart?
But those of us that understand the family unit and in the church family, it is our obligation as well as everybody else's too, to carry out what was laid out for us here.
I don't know, this will eventually be on the interweb, so I'm not even sure I should say it, but I had a really hard time coming to the Lord. Because the Bible talks about the Lord as a loving, nurturing, encouraging, uplifting Father. And I have no doubt my father would have taken a bullet for me. No doubt about that. But he wasn't the guy that I would choose for Saturday night, to hang out with. Let's just put it that way. He was a mean-tongued individual.
He enjoyed hurting.
He liked to slice people up with his tongue. And he was good at it. Boy, was he good at it.
Oh, yeah.
My mama took it for 35 years. And the thing that caused her to finally decide to leave him was they came to visit us in Germany and they were going from Germany to England. They needed to catch a train, and I was late getting there, getting them to their train. And he was just raking me over the coals. And as they pulled away, I don't know what I said to you, but the last thing my mother saw was me crying, and I was telling Sue something like, "You'll never see that man again." Anyway, I don't know why I'm going into all this.
That's okay.
But while we're here, and there's banana pudding over there.
Yeah. That's good.
What are y'all's ideas about pressing forward? We've probably got, I don't know, probably 3 weeks in Timothy left. Maybe more, maybe less. It doesn't get easier, unfortunately. Paul keeps up all this harsh talk. But for starters, Pastor Brian's going on sabbatical on the 25th of September, if I remember right, for a month. You know, you guys could too. He's going for a month, and during that month, I need to handle Sunday nights. And one of the Sunday mornings, I'm not going to be able to do studies here. So if somebody could take over, somebody could take over. What was it the boss in Office Space said? So if you could just do those studies during that month, that'd be great. You guys ever seen Office Space? No. Yeah, I'm gonna need you to come in on Sunday too. So if you could be here about 9, that'd be great. You up for that?
No.
Or we could do something else we do. One of the things I've been kind of thinking about doing was our tour guide in Israel did he came and visited Calvary Chapel in Spokane, Washington. He did a 6-part series on Israel, and it's really good. I tried doing it in the church one time, but the sound just wasn't right. People weren't able to follow him because he has a pretty thick Israeli accent.
Go figure.
We weren't any closed captioning or anything. He's really, really good. We could do that. We could do any other kind of videos. We've got some stuff from Answers in Genesis. That's really good. And anyway, we can think about that later. As far as how to run the group itself, what are y'all's ideas? Carol's already given me a pretty good idea to try and put a little bit more emphasis on prayer and fellowship and discipleship of each other throughout the week, rather than just coming together and chowing down and listening to Brian spout for an hour. Not quite an hour this time. Any ideas? I think I can probably go on the web and find a recording of some crickets to inject into this.
That's what we need right now, huh?
Come on, somebody's got to have some ideas.
You know, we could probably maybe even work it in a bit to it, something like that. Maybe take 1 week without any teaching and just have that as a time of praying together, holding up one another. What do you need? What do you need? What do you need? What can we do to find out these things and do what we can to stop working on how to help these things. Maybe that would be one night a month, you know,
Mhm.
or something, or every other week or something like that.
Yep.
And that way reduce the teaching time.
Mhm.
Maybe.
Teaching prep is not the issue.
Yeah.
I love doing that. Right? It's, you know, it's the effort that people have to do to keep their eyelids open. You know. But yeah, I think actually, for starters, we need to mix it a little bit.
Get somebody, we need to put some of that part into it. That's a good idea.
But you know, I love doing the preps, and you know, to be honest with you guys, I probably wouldn't read my Bible if I didn't have to come in here and get ready. You know, not nearly as much as I do anyway. I feel bad because I'm the only one eating that pudding. I don't feel that bad about it.
You already get ours.
He already had his too.
I'm hoping there'll be some left for about 10 o'clock. I can have another bowl.
That's the stuff that sweet dreams are made of right there.
It is good.
Anybody else got any idea?
Are you looking to do more, like hands-on physical stuff, or are you, like, what avenues
Actually, what I
are
was
you thinking?
thinking about was to start with a fence post driving ministry, where the group drives fence posts with Ryan and Sue.
You got a ram for your tractor?
No, I mean, kind of hands-on. Particularly in prayer and sharing prayer together, and in just ministering to one another. If that's what you mean by hands-on.
Mm-hmm.
We were full of ideas the other day, but
Well, I
your mouth
told
shut
them,
up.
I told them all to you, so I thought you were gonna explain it.
Told them to me, but you didn't tell them to anybody else.
Oh, I thought you were gonna explain it. You asked me to share with you what I was thinking, and I shared with you what I was thinking.
Please remind me.
I just was thinking, especially with Pastor Brian preaching on the emphasis of praying more. It's something we don't do as a group here. And take an evening and go around the room and what's going on with our lives. You know, what's happening that we can pray for each other about. What needs are there. And then follow through with that through the week by contacting somebody during the week to check up on
Pairing
them.
off.
You know, check up on them. Hey, you know, you mentioned like Monday night that you were really struggling with an anger issue or whatever. How's that going? How can I pray for you about that? You know, touch base with each other more. The Bible encourages us to keep each other sharp. You know, keep each other in the Word. You know, you could contact somebody and say, you know, hey, I read this morning in the Bible, you know, this, and what did you read? You know, and challenge each other more to be in the Word every day. Not as a checking on somebody saying, you know, but just genuinely to spur each other to good work, spur each other to keep growing in the faith, to keep leading into the Holy Spirit. Because as times get harder, we need to be dependent on each other more. We need to be encouraging each other more. And just once a week on Monday night, you know, or once a week on Sunday, you know, I don't think that's what God intended. I think He intended it to be a daily thing with believers. So that was my thought to you know, kind of move a little bit into that area too, instead of just coming and eating and, you know, and there's nothing wrong with having a Bible study. You need to study the Bible, but I think there'd be more interaction between us with sharing what we have needs of, sharing what's going on with our lives and how we can pray for each other, and then checking up on each other during the week.
And you know, something else that I have been thinking about was I'd like to do a little bit of a worship time too. You know, maybe, you know, every week someone new could pick something that they'd like to, for us to, you know, pick some songs, and that we could sing those songs together and talk about maybe what the songs meant to us or why we chose that. You know that one that I chose the other night. One bright hour, you will come for me. Just come on. You know, this is getting too bad. But yeah, that's another idea. I thought anybody have any ideas or objections to that, or does that sound good to people?
Well, I think singing is a vital part of the Christian life.
That's
Paul
because
and
you have a
Silas-
beautiful voice. I have to say it. I can't sing.
Don't worry, sweetie, we can turn it up.
Yeah, to crank it
But
up.
Paul and Silas, when they were in jail, they
Me
were
neither.
singing. You
I
know,
heard her.
I mean,
She does.
singing is worshiping together.
Wasn't that Philippi?
But you know what?
I've
The Lord
heard
hears it
Or
beautifully.
I thought it was you.
The Philippian jailer,
Yeah,
yeah.
they had the earthquake and all the doors were open and
Stomach
and,
acid, that's what hurts
and
my
he came
voice.
in with the light, wondering if all the prisoners, and he was going to kill himself because he lost all his prisoners. And Paul says, "Don't hurt yourself, we're all sinners."
And then his whole family was saved.
You
Yep.
will.
I like that idea, though. It's funny you bring that up because in the past couple of months I've gotten on Amazon with a couple of bucks that I've managed to save and some gift cards. I've started getting music books, you know, like a book with 125 hymns in it with, you know, the chords and stuff, and was thinking I should get back in the storage unit and go find my guitar and
Wow.
you know, so it's interesting you bring that up because I'm feeling a push toward that direction, but I also have to get, like, I just started the new job. I'm trying to get everything together and figure out what it is they're expecting from me right now, because what was originally said is escalated quickly over the weekend. So, you know, but I've been thinking about getting into all of that and seeing what I can find, you know. One of our projects this week, our little bunkhouse in the
Our project, you mean our.
in the camper, we, you know,
You've been voluntold.
she has. We got to go through all of our clothes bins because, you know, the stuff we originally brought a year ago might be slightly small now for somebody who's grown 9 inches this year, according to her physical.
There's a quick solution to that. Stop feeding her. She'll stop.
I know. But, you know, kind of getting everything cleaned up. I've got to fix the little bunk room because the way it is,
When do you start
for what?
school again?
Wednesday next week, Thursday. But I know my tummy's talking. Sorry, it's tired. It's had a rough 4 days. But you know, have room to get all that stuff back out. And I miss the music, and you know, I've been listening to the sermons recently about, you know, you're given, God gives you talents or whatever, and you should use them or you lose them. So I know music is one of mine. So
One thing you might want to check is her shoes. Because when I was growing like that, Daddy told other people that he was putting fertilizer in my shoes.
well, it was funny. We bought her new sneakers. What was it, 3 or 4 months ago? She came to me and she's like, "I need new sneakers." I'm like, "Why?" You know. she pulls the sole back on the front of the sneaker, and I'm like, go get the duct tape. She didn't like that answer. So took her to the shoe store in town, and I found some for myself. I was like, cool.
I heard this story a long time ago about shoes. This young kid, everybody else was, I'll just say, Converse All-Star shoes, you know.
Mm-hmm.
And that was a fad at one time. And everybody else was wearing Converse. So
This is before Michael Jordan.
I have a
Okay.
Converse pair.
but anyway, well, I wore Converse when I played basketball in high school. That was the shoe.
Mhm.
But anyhow, this young kid said, Daddy, I just got to have me a pair of them Converse All-Star shoes, and they got to be orange. And he was after his daddy day and day and night and night. And his daddy was an auto mechanic. So he went by the shop one day, and he was talking to his daddy, and his daddy was under the car on a creeper. So he grabbed up under the car and pulled himself out. And his daddy's shoes had holes in them that big and had cardboard stuck in his shoes.
Aww.
And he never asked his daddy about them Converse shoes again. I mean, he had shoes that didn't have holes in them.
Mm-hmm.
But his daddy was going to work every day with them white shoes.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So get you some duct tape.
I was thinking, get him some white Converse and make him go out and work in that Georgia clay.
Yeah.
I'll turn around.
Oh yeah.
They can work in the what? In the what? In the
The
Georgia.
Georgia Clay.
I didn't hear that last word. Okay.
Is that how Clemson adopted
I
orange?
think so.
We got to play
It was
ourselves.
easier than trying to have
And
to
North Carolina became
So does Tennessee.
North Carolina became Tar Heels.
Mhm.
But that's a real lesson in that little story.
I mean, my mother used to say, the more I look around, the more I'm happy for my own problems.
When you're looking for happiness, be happy with what you got.
Problems and all.
Have you ever noticed? I feel this way. Like there's plenty of things coming at you. Oh, this is this. This is this. You don't have this, or this is wrong. This is wrong. It's the darts, of course. You know, he exaggerates them all. But if you think about it, God lots of times brings it to you, and it's obvious too if you just calm down and take a deep breath and thank God. I mean, but yet He's got you comfortable. He's got you set where you can manage fine while you wait on God. You ever notice that? Now wait a minute. There's nothing really wrong here. I still have this, and I still have this, and I still can do this, and you know what I mean?
Yeah.
But really, we're still in our comfort zone, and God's taken us all the way through. Even though we think we gotta have this, we gotta do this, you know what I mean? The enemy's always trying to stir everything up, but really, the peace is there if you just stop and take a hold of God's word.
Well, Brian and I talk about this kind of thing quite a bit. But I really do think the reason that the church is on the slide in America, as far as the number of people that are part of the church, that are active in the church, I think the reason that we're on the slide, we're not persecuted enough. If we got some real, genuine persecution like the people in China have, the people in Iran have, people in Pakistan have, we'd come together. We would have each other's back because we'd have to. There's a blues singer from LA that wrote a song called Victims of Comfort. Victims of Comfort. Everybody likes a party, but nobody likes to clean.
Yeah.
Right.
But anyway.
And as you ride around the country and you look at these people, laborers, working on these buildings, building this and building that, 90% of them are Mexicans.
Oh yeah. That was
And that's because that's the
Willing to
only
work.
people they can get to work.
I was
Really work for a day's, wages.
I was reading a thing today about silicosis is on the rise. Your white lung.
Yeah.
And it's a killer. The victims are almost all Hispanic males. So we're working on them.
It's countertops.
Cutting their
Yeah.
countertops.
Yeah.
And they're bringing that junk in. And you know very well from where you used to work.
We used to come out of the plant and they had a thing in the floor at the front door. When you stepped on it, it wiped your feet when it was wiping the fibers off of your feet. But as you went,
Fiberglass.
yeah, fiberglass. And as you go out, you look out and the sun is setting and there's a whole cloud of white dust shining and it's all fiberglass. We wore no respirators. For many, many years, we wore no
Face masks.
safety glasses, no earplugs, and them balloons and the spinning frames, a clackety clack and a whee.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Sometimes 10 hours a day.
This way as deaf as a post.
Now I'm deaf from Vietnam, artillery.
Well, and you know the difference between him and the guys that are doing that today? He's not Hispanic.
Yep. That's because I had to work.
Yep.
It was an honor. It was an honor to work.
Oh
It's
yeah.
a blessing to have a
Yes.
job, you know.